Featuring prominent industry vendors, moderated by an independent analyst, Solutions Review presents the Tactical Roundtable, an expert panel discussion focused on solving enterprise challenges.
I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review, and welcome to this Tactical Roundtable on ransomware prevention and response, featuring a panel of solution experts, including KnowBe4, the largest integrated platform for security awareness training, Haiku, a global multi-cloud backup as a service provider, and Racktop Systems, an innovative active security platform for unstructured data. We've gathered this panel to break down the strategic threat of ransomware and discuss some of the best practices for defending against it while also preparing to recover from it. To drive this discussion, we've invited veteran data expert David Lotion. Recognized as an information management industry thought leader, David is president of the firm Knowledge Integrity. He has also been an analyst for TDWI and a regular contributor to TechTarget. In addition, David is a prolific author regarding information management best practices. David is also a senior lecturer and faculty lead for Careers and External Relations program at the University of Maryland's College of Information Studies. David, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much, Doug. And I want to thank our panelists and our attendees for joining our ransomware roundtable today. I'm going to ask our panelists to please introduce themselves. Let's go to Will.
Yes, Will Crittenden. I'm the technology evangelist for Racktop Systems. I've spent about 25 years in the industry, with time helping create the Burr division of EMC, the BCDR division of VMware, and a couple of storage and backup startups along the way, like Rubrik and Nimble.
Thanks. Eric.
Hey, my name's Eric Krohn. I've also been in cybersecurity for a long time. Back in the old Windows 3.1 days is when I started off. So, worked in various industries across healthcare, military. I was the security manager at the 2nd Regional Cyber Center, Western Hemisphere, for the U.S. Army, and dealt with all these different industries, a lot of which are actually impacted by ransomware these days, some of the key industries. Right now, I work with KnowBe4, which we do the security awareness training and simulated phishing platforms. And that's what I do now, as I go out and try to have conversations like this about how people can prevent this and recover from it better.
Thanks, Eric. And let's go to Dave, our third panelist today.
I am Dave Byers. I'm a senior field technologist at Haiku. I've got over 19 years IT experience around automation, data management, disaster recovery. I've worked as an IT admin for a large hedge fund back in my early days, where we had to do quarterly disaster recovery drills, focus on backup automation. I've also worked with companies as a senior system engineer at Commvault, Haiku, Data Domain, Cohesity, Veeam, and now with Haiku.
Thanks. So clearly we've got a bunch of experts here. But before we dive into our conversation, I'm going to ask Jonathan to provide an overview of what we're going to be discussing today. Jonathan.
Thanks, David. I'm Jonathan Paula, here to briefly introduce today's topic, ransomware. Organizations are rapidly acknowledging that the scope of cybersecurity and information risk is much broader than originally imagined. Malicious parties take advantage of different attack surfaces for a variety of end goals, often including disruption and extortion. Ransomware attacks, for example, use encryption to restrict an organization's data and then demand payment from the user to restore access. These attacks can be financially devastating. The average cost was $570,000 per incident in 2021. To say nothing of loss of business operations, disruption of critical systems, and damage to your brand's reputation. It's estimated there were around 4,000 successful ransomware attacks globally last year, and perhaps the best way to recover from one is with an effective backup strategy. Having a clean data repository unaffected by a potential hack provides a safe way to recover without having to pay. But what if those backups are encrypted as well? Today's roundtable will help keep you safe and share what to do if you find yourself a victim of a ransomware attack, with the following key tactics. Number 1, immutable and air-gapped backup technology. Number 2, redundancy, resiliency, and recovery. Tactic number 3, integrity, testing, and being prepared. And number 4, incident response plans. By implementing and using these powerful tactics intertwined with a robust backup strategy, individuals and organizations can minimize the impact of an attack and quickly restore their systems with their reputations intact. For more, let's start our panel discussion. Gentlemen, back to you.
Jonathan, thanks so much. I really appreciate that. That was great, and it actually gives us kind of the starting point to delve into the challenges of ransomware. And so I'm going to launch the first question with kind of a general question, and we'll start with Dave. What are some common pathways for ransomware attacks?
So first of all, there's numerous ways in which attacks can occur, but really the primary ones that I see is all around social engineering. And social engineering is a way to figure out a way in which an attacker can begin that attack, and it can take many different forms, from phishing to spear phishing to whaling to vishing. So, and as an example, I just got one this morning via text message on my phone. I took a look at it, and it said it was coming from FedEx, and I click here because we need more information before we can deliver a package. Well, clearly, that to me is an attempt to try and make an attack on myself. So it can take many different forms, but those are the common ones.
So, Eric, you've been in this business for a very long time, and I think you might be able to give us a little bit additional perspective around out what Dave was saying about the pathways for ransomware attacks.
Yeah, I mean, Dave's right. Social engineering is one of the most common ways that it happens, and we think about these attackers and all of these high tech tools, and stuff like that. And they do have some very high tech tools which they use once they're in the systems. But the initial network access so often is simply social engineering, and it's kind of ironic because if you think about how long email phishing has been a problem, right back to the Melissa virus and I love you days, it's kind of crazy that we haven't gotten our arms around that yet. We're making great progress with that, but that tends to be the most common way that they're getting in. The other thing that's a big issue related to that that helps them get in, or once they're in really lets them spread, is unpatched software. That seems to be one that they take advantage of.
Thanks. Will, would you like to
Yeah.
add to that?
The only thing I'll add there, right? The last study I read, over 70% of all attacks were initiated either wittingly or unwittingly from internal, right? Just to kind of add into what's being said there. But those are the known attacks too, and coming up with something and ways to protect against unknown is also one of our bigger concerns too.
Yeah, you actually touched on two key points. One is that we're not always necessarily being attacked from externally, but that they're often internal threats. And it's funny because often when I teach classes, I do a little informal poll among the attendees. I'll say, how many of you work for an organization that's been subject to some kind of cyber attack? And a bunch of people raise their hand. And then I'll say, how many of you don't know that your company has already been subject to a cyber attack? And that generally gets a little bit of laughter, but hopefully it causes a little bit of concern. So let's kind of drill down onto this a little bit. Generally speaking, are there any high level best practices that can be put into place when protecting data from either disasters or these types of cyber threats? Dave.
So when I was an IT admin, we were focused a lot on documentation and process control. That is going to be the best way at a very high level to begin making sure your data is protected, your systems are protected, your network's protected. When we did these quarterly disaster recovery drills, we were that prepared to where I actually had a playbook and I could hand it off to someone else who had no knowledge of what I was doing, and they could successfully recover data themselves. So really, I think it's all about the documentation. Ransomware has been around for 10 years or less, but you're seeing it more and more common, right? So what we want to make sure is people have a focus on doing disaster recovery drills, but also incident response drills. And I challenge people when I talk to them and saying, well, are you prepared for a disaster when it comes to your ransomware event? And typically, when I talk about incident response, they either say, well, I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is fully, and I don't have any documentation on it. And then we do have some larger organizations who are very familiar with it, and they do have everything completely documented, and they're very well prepared for the incident around ransomware events. But for me, it's all about the documentation process.
So it's kind of hard to argue with that in any way, but certainly organizations often maybe they create a checklist and they try to check off the items on the list in putting together their documentation and as part of that process. But Will, what do you think about how tools dovetail into those documented processes?
Yeah, so this is getting into more of disaster recovery and general best practices, right? All businesses should be following. One of the things is specifically around ransomware that I kind of touch on with my customers is you're either getting ready to be attacked or being attacked, or you're recovering from an attack, right? There is no other option in today's world. As far as the documentation goes, I've seen so many different companies build these great plans and then hand it over to someone who is very well trained and run a test, and everybody gives it a thumbs up. You have to build that documentation to the point where you can turn it over to somebody that's never stepped foot in the building again, right? That's one of the biggest keys that I've ever found with my customer base.
So Eric, maybe you can add to that a little bit and talk about raised awareness, because I think what Will's talking to, or the point that Will's talking to, is not just having a good plan, but actually having the socialization among all the individuals within the organization to be aware of what the practices are and how those processes need to be deployed. So what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so I mean, Dave and Will both make absolutely great points, and as far as documentation running through tests, this needs to happen, and it needs to happen with people that are serious. But you're right; it needs to go throughout. It needs to permeate throughout the organization, right? So I really think that the focus that we're doing right now on culture and going a little bit larger than making everyone aware, but making everyone a part of it, is a pretty significant thing. I mean, I've written up disaster recovery, continuity operation plans myself. And while that's great, unless you have everyone else involved in it, especially when you do tabletop type exercises, that can mostly be a useless piece of paper. But it's amazing what happens when you actually have people engaged and you run through a tabletop type exercise and you realize, hey, wait a minute, this system is really critical. If we don't have this, we don't even have our phone tree, and some of those sorts of things that people don't often think about. But we need to have the whole organization involved, from leadership all the way down to the people that are going to be pounding on the keys trying to get things back up. And I think that's an important thing, is don't build it in a vacuum.
And that brings up one other point too, right? Talk about we used to call them upstream and downstream dependencies. Eric, you just mentioned, but I've seen so many customers come in and make decisions based on it's the most innocuous person in the building said this is the most important app. At the end of the day, I usually sat down with a CFO and said, what is your most important app? And now let's figure out everything that has to come up before that. That's how you build an upstream downstream dependency correctly, right?
And that completely makes sense. I mean, one of the things that I'm kind of hearing is that there's like two different types of streams of concern involved in putting together this kind of plan. One is what is from a process perspective. One is from or I might say, one is from a practice perspective. One is a set of tasks that are applied in as part of those processes. And I think for the most part, there's still this general understanding that cybersecurity is about people breaking into your system and stealing your data, or people doing denial of service attacks, those types of things. And penetration testing is one of those tasks, or one of those capabilities that has been developed to address that. Is that still one of the mainstays of a cybersecurity strategy, the type that we're talking about? And Dave, maybe you can share some thoughts about that.
Certainly. So when I got my, before I answer that, when I got my start here at Haiku, one of the things that they tasked me with is to actually build an assessment tool to assess an organization's ability to actually recover from a ransomware event. Some of the questions really talks about the penetration testing aspect of this. So when we talk to organizations, penetration testing, whether they do it internally or hire a third party to do this externally, is very important. So there's a difference between like white box, black box. There's red hats and black hats, or blue hats and then purple hats. So along the different types of penetration testing, whether it be done third party or internally, it's very critical to do that, because we need to find out where those weaknesses are. And so whether we let someone know on the third party on the outside to let them know what is it they're going to be testing, or it's done blindly. But either way, we need to have the results of that penetration testing to see how well our applications are protected, network security systems, and others.
So one of the specific topics that we said we were going to talk about on this panel is backups and the use of backups as part of that overall strategy. And traditionally, backups have been used to enable recovery after some kind of system failure. But how has the concept of backups changed in the presence of increasing vulnerability to these types of cyber attacks and ransomware in particular? And Eric, why don't we start with you on this one?
Yeah, I mean, backups have they've been very helpful in the ransomware game. And in the past, when it was nothing but taking over things and denying you access to it, that was really what we focused on a lot, right? It was getting back up and running, business continuity, making sure that things were good. That was very important. Unfortunately, there are some things that have changed these days, especially with the exfiltration of data prior to the encryption these days, which adds an extra little level. Now, from the backup point, one of the things that I see people make errors with is not testing their backups and not making sure that they're isolated from the network or immutable. In other words, these bad actors get into these systems and they will target your backups to encrypt so you don't have access to those. And time again, we've seen organizations taken down because they thought that they could just restore their backups and be good. But they sadly underestimate what it takes to do that, the time it takes to do that, especially when working with cloud backups where you have to pull stuff through your one internet pipe, or again, leaving it open for these attackers to encrypt. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that happen that has caused the victim to have to pay the ransom.
So, Will, some thoughts on how backups have changed and how that's affected the way that organizations are trying to treat their
Yeah,
backup strategies.
we've all seen this, right? Backups and backup systems for decades have never actually had the due diligence spent that needed to be. For instance, every backup software out there has a validate button where it says validate the job after a backup, and every administrator doesn't turn that on because it is so resource intense, right? So we've kind of seen this. It's interesting. We've seen just like what Eric was talking about. We started off with encrypt your data, demand money. We've now escalated to the point where it's stealing data and holding that as an extortionware piece and encrypting data and having to recover from it. So while I absolutely believe we have to have the backups for that recovery piece of what's on-prem, we also are holding data in the backup world. I believe we're holding data far too long, that nobody needs to recover data that's 6 months old, right? So let's make it immutable. Let's make sure it's a good copy. Let's make sure it is restorable, and let's hold the data for the right amount of time and not throw money away on something to make us feel comfortable.
So that's a very good point, and I'm going to cycle back to that, but I want to pick up on one thread that you guys kind of left dangling there, which is what I'm going to summarize it in this question. What do you have to lose when the backups don't work the way that the organization expects them to? And Will, I think your smile there tells me that you've got something to share about that.
Well, and I'll kind of a round answer to this, right? I've seen a customer do this. This isn't a made up story. Oh my God, we've been encrypted. Let's go do a recovery. Okay, well, number one, what recovery point are you going to use, right? Last known good is very hard to come by in every world. So now I start doing a recovery. I test it. I find out it's infected. I go back again. We're talking days, if not weeks, where employees aren't able to leave, right? People are 24/7 by 365 at that point. So when it doesn't work, you have your business, you have your reputation, you have everything, and now you're forced to pay a ransom and hope, right? Fingers crossed that you can actually get your data back. Having backups that don't work is just, it should be an unacceptable thing. And I can't imagine what a stockholder would feel like if they found out about something like that, right?
Dave, do you want to weigh in on this topic?
Sure. Well, I totally agree with Will also. When I worked for the hedge fund, we would actually assign a dollar amount per minute of downtime because we wanted to find out how critical it was. And I mean, we had billions worth of dollars worth of investors' money and for any certain amount of time it was down. If you think about a downtime of an uptime of 99.99, you think that's good enough, but you look at that small little percentage, that can cost an organization a lot of money. So I am a stickler when it comes to disaster recovery, incident response, testing it, validating that you can actually do this, and practice it, because we want our engineers to get a good night's rest. We don't want them, constantly thinking, if I get attacked by a ransomware event, can I actually recover? Well, if you practice that on a quarterly basis, then you have that comfort level in knowing that I can perform that recovery without any problems at all. And also to have playbooks. Those playbooks can be handed off to someone else. Whether it be a disaster recovery. I live in Houston, so we're threatened with hurricanes. I know most of the organizations here are very well prepared. Everything is very well documented. But when it comes to a ransomware event, not so much. And I think some people think that because I've got backups, they have this misperception that they can recover based on just because I've got my backups, and that's not the case.
So Eric, let me focus on one aspect of something that Dave just said. Is there a significant difference between the use of backups for recovery from a non-ransomware event like a hurricane or a tornado versus ransomware? And is there a significant difference in the processes around that, or are they generally the same except for a couple of different variations?
I think Will touched on it earlier. And to me, the biggest thing is when you're restoring from a ransomware event, you've had a bad actor in your system. The modern versions of ransomware are not ones that somebody clicks a link and it just indiscriminately goes out and starts encrypting things. People are getting into the systems. They're spending a little bit of time there. They're setting it up, finding your critical things, and they're laying low for a little while. So you may restore last week's backup and it has the same backdoor that they had going in there. So what? You restore it, boom, it reconnects their command and control, and you start the game all over again. Where when you're talking about a disaster recovery due to a natural occurrence, that's going to be far less on the major focal point when it comes to that. You're not as worried about a bad actor who took you down having been in there for 3 weeks. So I think that's a key point and a key difference between those.
So it sounds like go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I like to, when I'm talking to customers and others, I like to talk about there's business continuity, there's disaster recovery. Those are two different things. To your point, David, it may be the same processes, it may be different documentations, but bringing up a copy of data and making it usable, right? That's not where that's the same no matter what. But you have to understand and you have to budget and plan for and pay for business continuity, disaster recovery, cyber resiliency, on and on and on, right?
You guys are bringing up some interesting terms, and I want to be able to come back to some of these more globally concerning issues and insidiousness of the difference between ransomware and a regular disaster. But I do want to make sure that our audience does have an understanding of some of the things that you guys are referring to. So, for example, one of you mentioned, or two of you mentioned before, air gap. You used the term air gapped about backups. What does that mean, Will?
Yeah, so taking a copy of data and isolating it so that no bad actor, good actor, really anybody inadvertent or not, that data is isolated and call it off-prem, right? In a perfect world, I would have it in a geographically disparate location so that I now have my disaster recovery guidelines covered. But air gapped in and of itself is just trying to have a pristine copy of data to what we've been talking about, where the bad guys can't get in and corrupt it.
And you guys use the term immutable backups. Eric, what does that mean?
Yeah. So, I mean, immutable backups are going to be something that's unchangeable, really. And this is something that, while I haven't necessarily seen it, maybe Dave or Will has, but when I put on my bad actor hat, I'm looking at things that I can do. I'm imagining going in once I have access to this network and actually messing with things within those backups. So if you try to restore from it, maybe I've changed some locations where payments go, or getting clever like that, built in some new accounts or something through these backups. If you can change those backups, you can do some pretty ugly stuff. And that's besides the fact that you can also encrypt it. And something I do see sometimes with people is especially in smaller organizations or those that don't have a full team. They say, well, my backups are already encrypted. That should keep them safe. But unfortunately, you can't encrypt something that's already encrypted. And so it doesn't protect it from that. But I find a lot of business owners don't really understand that difference right there. But yeah, basically you just have, it's ones and zeros, no matter how you look at it, whether it's previously encrypted or not.
And the interesting thing there, right? We talk about the storage, the immutable storage where that backup sits. But just understand, all I have to do is change a 1 and a 0 in the backup software itself, right? Or more importantly, in a client file index. That it's all a bunch of software that is easily destroyed or at least rendered ineffective. One other thing I'd like to touch on that Eric just mentioned, we talk about bad actors and malware getting in an environment and sitting. And everybody has this idea of, oh, it's like a white rabbit where it sleeps and waits until somebody hits the go button. We saw this in last year's solar flare attack, where the malware was in the environment for over 9 months and actually was not just sitting idle, it was retrieving and discovering and exploring data. And when I say exploring data, it was finding out things like passwords or patch sets. To Eric, I think you mentioned it earlier, operating systems that had not been updated correctly. That is all incredibly valuable information that was then sold to other bad guys. So that idea, and this is where backups, we have to have backups. We have to be able to recover from backups. But that theft of data, the exfiltration of data up front, is kind of the scariest thing at this moment, right? Somebody taking your data, and I talk again to customers where somebody stealing the secret Coca-Cola formula, they're going to get paid pretty quickly. But when the bad guy finds there's been some bad behavior by an executive that is something worth blackmailing over, that gets paid even quicker and maybe even more money. And there's no insurance to pay that one back either.
So this is kind of prompting me to pivot a little bit to maybe another topic for a moment, which is some of the things you're talking about are less about the encryption of data and demanding a ransom to be able to decrypt it, but rather what might be a more concerning, what might be called attack that's cutting across the environment to steal sensitive information or to infer sensitive concepts that are embedded within the organization. Is this what's meant by a data integrity attack? And what are some methods for preventing these types of attacks?
So I like to call it extortionware, right? It's ransomware, extortionware. Data integrity attack to me is more of taking the data and making it so that it is not able to serve its purpose. But on the unstructured side, and keep in mind, Racktop, where my company, we're talking about unstructured data. We're not talking about the structured side. I absolutely need backup and everything that we have on the structured side of the house. But we're actually looking at transactions from the user. So we're taking each transaction as it comes in and judging it on an assessment scale of whether that behavior is good, bad, or indifferent. If you think about it, right, opening a file, renaming it, deleting it, that's normal behavior. That's what ransomware does, but it does it at mass scale. So I'm looking at those actions, I'm judging the behavior, and I will shut off a bad user and stop bad actors at the storage layer. The difference is there, I'm doing it in line, I'm doing it in real time versus having to look at log files later on down the road.
So Dave, you've been kind of quiet here, but let me ask you, because you made reference to this earlier about assessing some value of information that's been subject to some type of attack, and then kind of folding that in with what Will was saying in terms of sensitivity of information and maybe even expanding out the concept of ransomware to Will, what was the term you used? Extortionware. Yep. Extortionware. What are your thoughts on that?
It's protecting data at all costs. To have someone who can come into that network. The thing I tell people a lot is that you have to segregate, isolate that information. When Will was talking about a hacker going after the backup application, Well, one of the questions I ask people is your backups also on the same production network? If the answer is yes, I'm like, that's a huge gaping hole. You need to fix this. So we need to isolate those backups. We need to make it as difficult as possible for that hacker to traverse networks and to get where they need to go. The other thing too is to look at my security policies and making sure that only those people who need to have access to certain systems have those access to those systems. Or if an employee goes from one role to a different role within that organization, they have to reassess those security privileges. If a person leaves that company, we also need to make sure that that person is locked out immediately. So there's a lot of protection controls that we can actually put in place to stop a lot of those threats.
And there are, and this is one of those things where human nature ends up being our worst enemy, right? And all of us. One of the best statements I've heard is that I think it's Microsoft put out, if you were to have all of your systems patched up to the latest and greatest patch with Microsoft, they can stop every known bad malware out there. Right now, it's kind of a little bit of a joke there. The fact that if I know about it, it's easy to stop. Right, so stopping the unknown is the problem. But
your 0 days, right?
Right. 0 days that's a whole different conversation. But if we know, we know for a fact, if we keep our systems patched, we're less vulnerable. But how many companies around the world can say that they're honestly patched correctly or consistently? Right. I mean, it's the way it is. Just to your point, Dave, I know that if this guy moves over to this job, I need to cut his access that day. And I guarantee there's very few instances of that type of environment in the world where it's done correctly to what we're talking about here. Yep. Right. Those holes are just, I mean, that's why the bad guys are way better at doing this than the good guys are at shutting it off.
Yeah. To your point, Will, I mean, when we look out there and we see these stories in the news all the time, how often is it a 0 day that's actually exploited, right? It's almost always 6 months old. I mean, we're still seeing all kinds of stuff from a year or more ago that's being actively exploited out there. If you look at the CISA list and the known exploited vulnerability, some of this stuff is old. And I get it. I mean, patching is tough because you run the risk of downtime and, all that kind of good stuff. But it's something that organizations really need to take seriously.
Yeah, we would also do, making sure we had a QA, test, dev, prod. So we had distinctions between those. So as we would roll out a patch, we'd roll it out where we could actually do it in, a pre-production environment that was not production, and making sure we can test and validate that it works and that there were no backdoors that were left open before it actually rolls into production.
And to be fair, right, when you're talking about a multi-million or multi-billion-dollar company, I've done a ton of work with the large financials, world banks and things like that. Those types of organizations, while they still are almost as ineffective at doing this, they have people and resources and time and money dedicated to it. You come down to the middle and lower end of the pyramid of customers, you've got one guy trying to be your server, storage, network, data. His hands are full, right? So that's one of the biggest problems. And again, it's hard to call it laziness. It's just there's not enough time.
Local governments, state, stuff like that, school districts, those poor folks, it's one person trying to juggle a whole bunch of plates at once with a $4 a year budget, and my heart goes out to those folks. But that's one of the reasons I think we see them so high in the ransomware statistics as far as getting hit. They know that they're eventually going to be able to pay something because they can't shut down a government. But those poor folks, to your point, Will, they're working hard. It's not like they're slacking. It's not, but they just don't have the resources.
Right. So you guys are all kind of circling around concepts of redundancy and resilience, and I want to get to that in a moment. But I do want to ask kind of your opinion, which is you guys are all talking about making sure that all the patches are done and done the right way. What happens when you've got systems where there's inconsistencies between the different versions of the items that are being patched? I mean, how do you deal with that, Eric?
Well, I'm not sure exactly if this is going to answer that question, but when you talk about certain things, so I worked in medical for a while, did a lot of stuff in medical. And I'll be honest, there's some machines out there that are still running like Windows 95, right? It's an MRI machine. It makes the greatest images the doctors ever want to see. They never want to see this machine gone. You have a Windows 95 machine on your network. What do you do about it? Well, you need to isolate that thing. You need to take some other mitigating steps in order to keep those things alive. You may not ever be able to patch these things. There may not be patches available, and there may be glaring vulnerabilities. But that's where we have to think outside the box and not just patching. There's a lot of other things that we can do, you know, again, microsegmentation or working into those sorts of things. You know, if you look at what the patches actually do, sometimes you can actually go in and manually do what the patch kindly does for you automatically. So even if it's not available in a patch form, you may be able to up a version of SMB or something like that to take care of it. So we always have to think about that as well. And don't say, well, this box can't be patched and just move it off to a corner and forget about it. We have to keep that constantly in our minds as vulnerabilities roll out. It's a task. It's quite a bit of work, but ultimately we need to do that in order to keep those from causing a lot of problems.
So let's drill down into redundancy versus resilience. So what do we mean by system redundancy, and how's that contributing to recovery or continued functionality after any kind of shock to your enterprise systems? Will, how about you start on that one?
So redundancy to me is kind of like what we were talking about before, right? Business continuity. And I need to have, if I have an application that needs 5 nines of uptime, I need to have redundant servers and redundant storage and no single point of failure. And a single point of failure could be somebody pushing a button, right? So that's to me redundancy. Resiliency is that idea of this box has been burnt in, it's been tested. I know the uptime. I know that the patching is done correctly, and I have the ability to guarantee that resilient piece of hardware is not going away. I would also argue that resiliency and redundancy comes along when you start talking about your manpower as well as your documentation and your processes around the environment.
So Dave, are there different types of redundancy? And if so, are any different types particularly better for protection against the effects of ransomware?
So redundancy, it could be, software, it could be hardware. If I have a hardware, say a data domain, and I've got a disaster recovery facility somewhere else, I've got a secondary data domain, or it could be NetApp, Nutanix. It could be a variety of hardware devices. But as long as I have that redundant data on those 2 different locations or 2 different hardware platforms, or if it's software based, I've got one locally here, but I can also have another redundant copy up in the cloud. So when I talk about a 3-2-1 rule, and I ask people, do you follow 3-2-1? What is a 3-2-1? Well, it's 3 copies of data, 2 different media, and one is always offsite. And when I say 2 different media, it could be those 2 different hardware devices, or it could be one hardware device locally, one up in the cloud. So as long as I follow that 3-2-1 rule, that's going to give me that good redundancy and making sure. And also, it's just not redundancy on the data itself, but it also could be servers themselves. So if I have I want to practice good disaster recovery, I might have a primary data center in my local town, but also have, I can spin up servers in the cloud somewhere else. And I can do it very quickly, which is then that resiliency piece. So if I have a failure locally, I spin up a VM up in the cloud and I can turn on because all of my data is sitting there in that cloud environment ready to go. So
and resiliency can also deal with if another section is down, like Will was talking about the order of bringing things up. If one system is down, does that totally take out that machine or not? Right? We saw a certain airline recently kind of melt down as their systems encountered a lot of load and some unexpected sorts of things happening, and it did not fare well. I think that's a great example of resiliency versus redundancy.
Right. And Dave, thanks for bringing up the 3-2-1.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite ever.
It's great that we still talk about that all these years later. Sometimes I feel like I'm alone because that comes back from the tape days, right? But I think it's still so important these days to follow that same concept. I agree with you 100%, Dave.
Yeah.
And just as a tack on to something we were talking about before, would you say that that the cloud provides, you would say in some of the object storage mechanisms that provide immutable storage for your backups, Dave?
So that lends into, a variety of ways you can protect your data from snapshots, which is a really good one to talk about a disaster. I can always fall back on that latest snapshot if I need to. But snapshots, you don't want to really want to or can follow up on those if it's an incident because of a ransomware event. But I also need to have backups, and I need to protect those backups for a certain length of time. I also need to have archives and archive those off into possibly immutable storage for longer periods of time. I'll give you an example, and this happened with a company that I knew about up in Wisconsin, where they were actually they were attacked. It was a ransomware event. Unfortunately, they actually sat on their network for about 6 months, and they learned a lot about the environment. One of the things they learned about was that backup environment. Once again, they thought their backups were good enough. They didn't have any kind of incident response plan, so they end up having to pay that ransom because they really thought their backups were good enough.
So that's an example of something that seems to go wrong even when you're recovering from backups. What else can go wrong, and what can we do to address that using a better backup strategy? And Eric, I'll jump to you for that one first.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned before, we've seen a lot of places go down because their backups were encrypted. They thought they were good, they were network accessible, and all of a sudden things went bad, right? And so we've seen that puts pressure on there. And if we think about ransomware, ultimately what it is ransomware. You pay the ransom because you're under significant amounts of pressure, whether that's to keep the doors open because all of your customer information has been encrypted and you no longer have access to it, whether it's the extortion piece, which, a lot of, some of these players are even skipping the actual encryption piece and just going, you know what, extortion gets me enough money. But all of these things definitely play into this. I think that we really have to consider that, I'm going to go on a little tangent here, but I think that while we're focusing a lot on the backup piece of here, that's very, very important. We also have to focus on avoiding it in the first place, because that extortion piece is so much of a key here. And frankly, once you're restoring from a backup, that's great. Maybe you'll get your stuff up and running, but you still have that other issue. I mean, this started back in 2019 with the Maze ransomware group leveraging that. And it has really driven up the cost, like we heard earlier in the intro, $570,000 per incident on average. But we see them in the millions all the time. It's crazy how this has kind of rolled into that.
And I would argue a little bit that number is skewed because not every ransomware attack gets reported, right? There are a lot of customers and businesses that are like, no, I don't want to tell anybody that we just had a mistake. Right. So what Eric just mentioned about prevention, that's one of the reasons why I was drawn to Racktop from the beginning, is because of our ability to stop that bad behavior. But again, to your point, no amount of recovery is ever going to bring my data back on site once it's left the building. And I do a lot with federal and DoD, and those guys. Ransomware is never really my concern with that customer. It's around data theft.
Yeah.
Right. So we're trying to prevent it. And the other thing that we keep seeing with the bad guys, right? Once the data is out and you've paid the ransom, there's no guarantee they're going to delete that sensitive data. There's no guarantee that you're going to get your encryption keys back. So to Eric's point, let's try to prevent it before it happens.
So it sounds like having an active or a proactive strategy can help minimize the impacts of some type of cyber event. Do you guys have any suggestions about, other than what you've just said, what are some other capabilities or features that you might want to consider adding to your defensive wall to do that minimization?
Oh, I love this question, David. Coming from KnowBe4, where we handle the human side of things. I mean, that's really our focus, is the human side of things, the education, and then doing the simulated attacks, the phishing attacks, as a way to practice what we've taught you in the other side. We talked about it earlier. I mean, the human factor is so often the first way in. And in my opinion, and in my experience, educating people to be able to spot these and report them is a very key thing. and helping them understand why it's so important to do these things, why it's important to pay attention, why we can't just go, oh, well, if the IT department doesn't want me to click on that, then they wouldn't let me. Or if they don't want me to go to that website, they would block it. Well, how many websites are brought up every day by cybercrime groups and stuff like that? It's an impossible thing. So in my opinion, working on the education piece for the people in the front and helping them. And again, this protects them personally too, because believe it or not, ransomware does hit people at home. That's happened a number of times. But that kind of stuff to me is absolutely a critical piece that I think a lot of organizations leave out.
Yeah, Eric, I totally agree with you on that. I think when an IT department or a security department is looking at how they can prevent things from happening within the company, it goes much wider than just the security team or the backup team. It needs to be a corporate-wide initiative to making sure that the people themselves actually are protecting that organization and the organization's data. And it really also, and like Eric said, it starts from that end user, because those phishing attacks, if people are not prepared, and if you look at social media and people who are on LinkedIn or Facebook, the hackers, that is a gold mine for them, because now they can get more personal with that individual, and it becomes a more targeted attack to an individual within an organization, because now they can actually feed them information they've gleaned from LinkedIn or Facebook to actually customize that email or text message even more personally to get them to bite on it. And that's one of the big dangers. So like Eric said, it really needs to be focused on more training for those end users themselves to be prepared for what they might see in an email or text message.
And
oh yeah, go ahead, Will.
just to add into that, right? The bad guys only need one mistake.
That's right.
That's all it takes.
So I'm gonna push back a little bit on this, because in my role as a consultant on a number of different projects, all staff, whether they're employees or whether they're external consultants, are asked to take a security awareness training. Certainly when we do contracts with the government and we go through those, and they typically go over the same topics. Phishing, the same types of things, Dave, that you mentioned before, all those social engineering aspects. But to what extent does that really hammer home the criticality of awareness, and how can organizations be better at raising awareness to good practices for cyber attack preparedness?
David, I'll say this. You mentioned like government stuff. Boy, I tell you, I took that DISA training about 5 years in a row, the exact same training one time a year. And that's going to keep me safe for the whole rest of the year, right? That's a mentality in a lot of this stuff. And frankly, that needs to go. That needs to be out of here. We don't want to do an annual training and then call it good for the next year. If you want people to really understand the threats, you want to give them short training that's maybe relevant to what they're going to go through or what they may be facing now. Like right now, we're at the beginning of the year. How many people are going to be experiencing folks trying to get their tax information so they can fraudulently file their tax returns, W-2 fraud, things like that within organizations? Well, why not put out stuff that matters right now? Hey, watch out for this, folks. People are going to try to do that. That's how you get people engaged in that and wanting to do it. Throwing them in a room once a year or throwing them online with some online training once a year for an hour, that's not going to do anything, honestly. It's just not. So we need to have a different viewpoint and strategy of how we're tackling that if you want to be effective. And I tell you, what I've seen is places that take it seriously, and that doesn't mean a lot of effort, but take it seriously and break it down like this, have huge rewards when they do it.
Well, what's your perspective on that? I mean, I think you mentioned earlier that there are some of your clients you don't worry about it, but
Yes.
how do you balance that question
Completely,
about?
completely agree with Eric. And the funniest fact I heard, Eric, you probably know this, the general phishing training that we see is effective for about 48 hours, right? So I actually said if I was trying to attack somebody, I'd learn when they were doing that phishing training, and 3 days after it, I'd start bombing them with all kinds of click here links, right? It is you have to get the end user to understand the importance It's not just that you're trying to make them do something so you can check a box. You're trying to help them make the business more successful, trying to keep the threat of a cyber attack out, because and fear, right? It's a little bit of fear, but that helps.
They have to be active in helping the organization protect its data.
Right.
They have to be very active.
Yeah,
Right.
and it is everybody's job. And I hate to say that. People go, oh, well, it's not, I'm not the security people. But here's the deal. Let's look at the security programs or the safety programs that organizations have had over the years, especially in manufacturing, right? It's everybody's job to do safety. Now, they've been doing this very well for years. And yeah, it's a little bit easier to get the concept of if you put your arm in here, you may lose it, and that's going to impact you. But they've been working on that for years with the posters. It's been X number of days since Bob threw something bad in a machine or something along those lines. We need to take that mentality and work at it when it comes to the security piece within organizations. And when we say building a good security culture, this is the kind of thing we're talking about. We're talking about people that look around and go, oh, Frank left his machine unlocked again. I'm going to go over there and hit Windows L and lock it for him. That's the kind of stuff that you do in the security or in the safety programs where you go, oh, that safety chain's disconnected. I'm going to go latch that again. We can learn a lot from that in our industry when it comes to educating people.
So what you're pointing to is actually one of the, I think what I might take as my last question before we get to the wrap up, which is what are some additional aspects of a strategy for protection from these types of attacks? You've given a little bit of insight into it. I think we clearly don't understand the complete quote unquote attack surface because there's all sorts of things going on that we don't know about. So what can organizations do to put together a comprehensive strategy for protection from ransomware and other types of cyber attacks? And Eric, I think I'm going to go back to you on that because you started that topic. Let's see what else you've got to share on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to address the human element. You have to address the backups. There's no way around that. Honestly, I think these days, if you want a good, resilient type of strategy against this, you need to have some sort of DLP, data loss prevention controls in place. Because how many times do we see a terabyte of data went out of this network? Those are kind of the key things there. I'm also a big fan of network segmentation to kind of limit where people can go and be able to better see some of the traffic that's going there too, instead of having a flat network like what happened with the UK's NHS. That was a flat network when WannaCry hit that, and so it could spread like crazy. So those are kind of my key things that I really try to work on. And then last but not least by any means is see what permissions people have, because here's something people don't think about. If a person has permissions to write to a file, they can encrypt it. But if they don't, if they can only read it, yes, they can steal it, but they can't encrypt it. So who has permissions to these shares within your organizations, and how often have you audited those? So I'll leave it at those for my tips.
Dave, why don't we go to you next?
Yeah, so I agree with Eric also. And for me, it's a lot about process documentation training and testing, validation. So there's a lot of things that can go into this too. And I'll fall back to another thing that I mentioned earlier in the conversation too, was about the assessment that we had created here at Haiku called R-Score. This is one of the ways we can actually let organizations know how prepared they truly are for a ransomware attack. So when we ask organizations today, how prepared are you? You're going to get varied answers, right? But most of the time you're going to say, well, you're going to hear people say, well, I've got my backups, so I can rely upon those. To me, when we talk about R-Score and this assessment we've created, it goes into 5 main areas. Those 5 main areas have many different questions. And by the end of this, you actually have an idea of how prepared you are for that ransomware event. And I'm surprised we've done this with some MSPs, and they themselves, because they deal with other organizations' data, they did not score so well. But for them, this is very enlightening and eye-opening for them to take this assessment, because that now helps them prepare them to help their customers protect their own data themselves, and for that MSP to protect data's environment as well.
So let's go to our lightning round last words. Each of you try to take 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds. What's the last thing you want the listeners to, or the viewers to remember when they're watching this panel? Will, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so just to kind of follow on with that last piece too, Eric and Dave absolutely are correct. I will say that on the unstructured data side of the house, which seems to be the target and the attack vector most commonly hit, we're the only product out there that can stop bad behavior in real time, right? So we become not only a DLP, but we become a high integrity sensor on the environment to tie in with other tools to help you avoid and recover if need be on the structured side of the house.
Dave, some last words?
I tell people, don't put the blinders on. Don't ignore instant response. Don't ignore ransomware. Open your eyes and look at what's actually happening. The thing that we do here at Haiku is we are a SaaS-based data backup recovery for both on-prem and also cloud environments. So we've got a very good data protection, migration, disaster recovery, ransomware protection suite. And so once again, don't put those blinders on. Open your eyes and think outside the box, making sure you're very well protected. Everything is well documented, tested, validated.
Eric, how about your last words?
Yeah, I want to say that there's no silver bullet for this. It takes a combination of different things. It takes the human layer, it takes processes and procedures, and it takes technical tools to defend against this sort of thing. Now, we're generally pretty good with the technical stuff, especially us techies like this, but we're not always great with the human side. So, but think about that. You really do need to address that. The other thing I will say is, I don't care what organization you are, what size you are, whether you're a single physician doctor's office or whether you're a bakery down the street, you're never too small to be a target for ransomware. If you have an email address, you have a website, it doesn't matter. They use a lot of automated tools in many cases to push this stuff out there. It doesn't matter if they can get 50 grand from you or 500 grand from another person. You're still a target because that's $50,000 they didn't have. So don't ever think that you're too small to be noticed or targeted for these types of cyber attacks. That's just such a huge problem.
Well, thank you, folks. Dave, Eric, Will, I appreciate your participation in this panel. And Doug, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thanks, David. Will, Eric, and Dave, that was an excellent discussion. Thank you for your participation. We hope you have enjoyed this tactical roundtable. Until next time, I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review. Thanks for watching.